Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Laurin, and today I'm interviewing my friend, Tony Montgomery. Tony has his master's in exercise science from USF. He is a former Marine, and while he will not say this, he is an all-around badass athlete. So, I know you're so uncomfortable right now.
Very much so. The last thing I want to do is talk about myself.
I know, but let's get a brief introduction. It can be brief, but I do want to hear a little bit about you so listeners can have a background before we dive into our topic, which I'm really excited about. This is what you're going to be studying in your PhD, but more importantly, this is like how you've transitioned as a coach over time, like your methodologies, and now you're going to be studying it even more. So
yeah.
First, background.
All right. So
you're on the spot.
On the spot. Like Laurin said, I've spent 4 years in the military. I was lucky to be stationed with 2nd Recon Battalion, which is the second, it was just the Marine Corps' like Special Forces unit. So I got to be around a lot of amazing fighters, amazing teammates and stuff like that, which was something that allowed me to kind of like think about the boundaries of like sports performance and mental exploration and stuff like that. And that made me go into exercise science. And like you said, I got my master's at USF in exercise science. And then along the way, I've competed in strongman. I've done powerlifting where I totaled 2,004 pounds. And recently I've transitioned to doing more of endurance type stuff. I just ran a marathon and did
casual marathon
in 3 hours and 42 minutes. So nothing like groundbreaking.
I feel like that's really good. I don't know.
Maybe.
Okay, that sounds pretty good.
You're not breaking any world records or qualifying for the Olympics, but
I didn't think so. You're also like not really the marathoner. What do they call you guys?
Clydesdales. Yeah. It's a nice way of saying you're fat. But yeah, I noticed when I was like the only one with the 2XL shirt, I was like, I'm probably not meant to be here. And then I also compete in jiu-jitsu as well. I've competed in Pan Am's IBJJF 2 years in a row and took 3rd place as a white belt and a blue belt.
So when I say all around badass athlete, Tony can do a lot of different things. And what's so interesting about all of that is that it is so different, which is why, you have such a great knowledge base as a coach. And there's so many competing things when we're talking about all of that, right? Like whether it's, strength or endurance or something like jiu-jitsu, which involves a lot of things, which is such a different, when you train for powerlifting, it's so specific. And even when you're training for endurance, it's so specific. And, you do need to lift. And, for anybody who's a powerlifter, you should be doing a little bit of cardio.
Should be, for sure.
Should. But again, those are very extreme. When we're talking about something like jiu-jitsu, it is such a big overlap of all of, like, you literally need everything. You need strength, you need explosiveness, you need flexibility, you need endurance.
Right.
But so how your PhD, you're going to be going to Oklahoma State.
Yeah, Oklahoma State University.
Do you want to make sure I say that right? That you're going to be studying fatigue and human performance.
Yeah, that's one of the main categories that they look at. They also have a neuroscience type of side as well, which I think that those go hand in hand when you're looking at fatigue and human performance is, what the mental aspect is along with the physiological one. So it'd be cool to be able to look at those things individually and then combining them together.
Everything. I mean, honestly, like your physical state follows your mental state.
Right.
And the more that I coach and just experience like, my own training and own life, like those things go together so much. And I think a lot of times, or we used to, at least I used to, and I think still to some degree, the science does separate that. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's like, there really is such a big overlap here. And if like, we're not focusing on both of those or how your mindset influences everything else, like we're really doing people a disservice. So I'm really excited for you to be, studying that and combining those two things. But I know that you wanted to touch on this, but how you said that you've been changing how you train and program for clients. So what were some of the things that you were maybe doing before that you've changed your methods on? And then we can dive into those specific methods that you're interested in.
Yeah, definitely. So with strength athletes in particular, because
that's what
I've always done. Well, when I first started, I did a lot of football players because that's what I did. I played football and rugby and stuff like that. So I got to work with like some guys in the NFL, some guys getting ready for the NFL Combine. So learning like energy systems and training those athletes was a lot of fun. But specifically as you compete, you probably train the people you compete with the most, because you build up that reputation of like, unfortunately, if you lift a lot of weight, people assume you know what you're talking about, which is not always the case.
Definitely not. It's the same thing when people look really good. You're like, oh, they must totally know how to program somebody's diet. And it's like, they might. And there are people who do.
Right.
However, not always. That is not a sure sign way that you're going to have a good coach. It might be, but it's not always.
Not what I would break the bank on, that's for sure. But yeah, so with strength athletes, you're taught a lot within the literature and within just the kind of like the grand scope of training is like volume is such a huge driver of performance. So I would get ready for a meet, and as I'm getting ready for a meet, or my athletes are getting ready for a meet, you would try to drop the volume so that fatigue starts to dissipate and fitness can go up, and that way they can showcase their strength. And you always hear a lot too in strength athletics is like, you don't go into the gym to test your strength, so you shouldn't be doing singles all the time because that's testing your strength. That's not building your strength. So it's the idea of like continuously trying to build something as opposed to testing stuff. Right. So that was always like the precipice of like how I train people. And after a meet, when you're doing singles to get ready for a meet, your fitness is down. So then we would do some type of GPP or some type of volume block to rebuild that fitness and rebuild volume. And the idea of like the bigger the muscle, the bigger the athlete, the stronger they're going to be. And then just over the years, especially these last 2 years at USF and being around Dr. Buckner and just understanding like his scope of how he asks questions and like looks at things, and then just kind of implementing that within my own programming. And then once you think about it, it's very much almost commonsensical in a way to where it's like, oh, I can't believe I haven't been doing this, sooner. And the idea of, when you think about shifting that paradigm of like volume may not be the thing that you should be focusing on, because one, the more volume you're going to attenuate or accumulate, the higher the risk of wear and tear injuries can be. And if you're injured, you're not being able to train at your full capacity. And then also too, if you're doing a lot of volume and you're getting significantly away from the actual absolute load that you can lift, say your best squat is 500 and you're doing volume in the 315, you're talking about almost a 200-pound difference. So that doesn't necessarily always translate to being able to continue to build that strength that you're looking for. But you're trying to build volume with the idea that you're going to grow muscle. And then when you think about that, right, like bodybuilders, they're trying to grow muscle year round. And at best, natural bodybuilders may put on a pound a year if they're lucky, right? A lot of natural bodybuilders compete at the same weight class their entire career. Could be 10 years, could be 8 years, but they don't really put on a lot of muscle. And one of Dr. Buckner's ideas is like, once you hit that threshold of like the newbie gains, so to speak, how much actual muscle can you put on? Is there a limit until you start adding in anabolic steroids? And, I work with a lot of athletes that do anabolic steroids, and that kind of makes things a little bit different, but not much, right? Because even when you look at the top IFBB pros that are using steroids, they're maybe putting on like 5 pounds of muscle a year to 10 pounds of muscle a year. And that's strictly dedicated hypertrophy work year round. Right. So if you think, okay, well, a powerlifter is going to do this massive 8-week block of volume, it's like, how much muscle are they actually going to put on? And is that 8 weeks of volume going to leave them like worse off when it goes to their strength block? Right. And when you think about like block periodization, block training, the idea of trying to chase after one characteristic of adaptation of like hypertrophy, muscle size, and then going into a strength block and trying to, put all that new size, because they say bigger muscle is going to produce force, and that's true. Like a bigger muscle will produce more force over time, but how much bigger are they actually getting during an 8-week block of dedicated like volume training, and then getting away from that volume training, and then how much they lose when they get away from that. So it's like, are you just spinning your wheels perpetually, block after block, chasing after something that you're never really going to get, when you should be maybe focusing more on, the actual mechanisms that drive strength and the things that'll keep you healthier over time. And then just pairing that with like some of the research I've been doing on fatigue and what creates fatigue and allows people to train a little bit more extensively without as many deloads, then it just kind of all makes sense. Like volume may not be the biggest driver to getting stronger. And then the higher the volume, the more fatigue you're going to accumulate, and more central nervous system fatigue you accumulate, which is something that people get wrong all the time is, they're like, oh, I'm doing a lot of singles, so my nervous system is fried. And that's not actually the case. And the research kind of points to central nervous system fatigue comes from higher volume thresholds being met. So if you're constantly chasing this hypertrophy, this high volume, then you're also going to be in a more fatigued state every time you go into the gym. The more fatigued you are, the less likely you're going to be able to perform at a high level, and then the more likely you are to get injured. So I was like, well, let me just take away that entire thought process of like hypertrophy training and chasing after bigger muscles for strength athletes, and let's just focus on skill acquisition, the STED principle, neural adaptation, and things along, and then injury prevention, and then just focusing on those aspects of training instead of volume being the biggest driver. So that's like the biggest thing that I've changed when it comes to training and how I coach my athletes and train my athletes.
And again, just to be clear, that is for strength athletes.
Correct.
Right. This is not for Gen Pop. This is not for a bodybuilder.
Right.
This is not for somebody who's just looking to recomp. This is if you are particularly training for one skill, which is to be stronger at 3 lifts in particular.
Yep.
That is what Tony is talking about. And I think sometimes, I do want to delineate that, because a lot of times people will hear certain conversations and they take that out of context, and then they're like, wait, so I shouldn't be training with more volume? It's like, no. You're looking to recomp, you know what I mean? Like, you're looking to have like a life, like you're a lifestyle client who wants to build muscle. Like, no, we should certainly be doing volume.
Exactly.
And with strength athletes in general, I would say that one of the things that at least I've seen over the years, working with people and just being around that kind of space, especially powerlifting, people come in and out so quickly.
Yeah.
It's so rare to see people stick around. Well, one, it's very taxing. Yeah. It's it's just a very taxing sport. Powerlifting is one of the most like unrewarded sport. I don't know. Like, I don't really know how to describe it, but like there's like no accolades, right? There's no accolades.
No.
There's no money. There's no real anything. You know what I mean? Like, it's not even like, hey, I have this banging body because I could be like, you really don't have a lot to show for it.
No.
You know what I mean? Like, it's literally a pure dedication of like, I want to push myself and I enjoy these specific lifts, like, right? Like, so it's a very unique group. And like, I've, obviously been around powerlifters for a very long time, and they are some of the most dedicated people to their craft. I think because of that, you know what I mean? People who stick around because you're not doing it for any other reason besides that you really fucking love it. But if you're not intelligent with your programming, it is so easy to get knocked out with injuries. And I would say the biggest reason that we see these big name people, not even just big name people, but the people that you see around, who are getting strong really, really quick, they get so injured.
Yeah. And
then you add on, if somebody is taking anabolics, right, they're taking a lot, which, whatever you do, whatever you want to do. But then they're getting these injuries, and then it's just everything just kind of compounds out of nowhere. And then you're like, you never hear about these people ever again. Oh, yeah. And there's so many people that I could think of from years ago that you're like, damn, like they were, setting all the world records and doing all this, and then they just completely are gone. Right. And you could say the same thing to a degree with bodybuilding, only because of the physiological effects, right, of being that lean. And pushing yourself that long, and especially when there is, drug use there. But I would say that it's just even more so in powerlifting. People just come in and out because of injuries. And I would say that the most important thing really is managing that. Like, out of everything else, what do you think? Like, I think that is probably one of the biggest things. If you want a long-lasting powerlifting career, I would say try to stay as injury-free as possible, which is hard because the lifts that you're doing are so taxing on your body, and they're so repetitive. Like, when you're a bodybuilder, you're just trying to grow muscle, right? You can do that 100 million trillion different ways. You know what I mean? But when you're picking a performance sport that is so specific, even something like an endurance training, right? That's all repetitive. Something like jiu-jitsu, super repetitive. I mean, we're doing very different movements at all times, but it's incredibly repetitive. How many times can you get armbarred before your elbow's like, hey, don't want to do that anymore? You know what I mean? Yes. And you're repeating. Exactly. My elbows are like, what the fuck? But like, so with powerlifting, the lifts are not only just repetitive, but they're just taxing lifts. Like back squatting is really hard on your body. Deadlifts are pretty hard on your body. Bench, hit or miss. It's usually you have some other issue because of the squats or the deadlifts. Right. Or if you're just like a crazy bencher who's benching, 600-700 pounds, something like that, then you're going to probably develop some issues just from that. But you're going to get pretty banged up there. So I would say that for a strength athlete, managing fatigue and managing just kind of training and, like you said, volume in general is going to be really important. And that was a really great point with, how much muscle are you really going to build? And, I'm definitely in the camp still that, like, okay, if you are strong, if you are more muscular, it's probably not going to be to a detriment, right? But, well, it could be. there's always a level, right?
Yeah.
But like, is that the number one thing we need to be chasing? And the answer is probably not. Like, is it a bad thing at some point? No, maybe. But if you're trying to maximize your career as a powerlifter, you probably should be managing injuries and focusing namely on strength.
Yeah, I mean, within the confines of like injuries, beyond that, I think the other thing that leads people quitting is just the boredom of the sport, right? Because like you said, it's 3 lifts, and however you want to jazz that up, it's not going to be a fun thing, right? It's a very monotonous sport, and that's why a lot of people who do powerlifting at a high level are very introverted as well. It kind of fits their personality dynamics. People that can go to the gym and do the same maneuvers over and over again every single day and not like get tired of it are the ones that usually last very long.
Mm-hmm. Who talks about that? Somebody talks about personality types with powerlifting. Who is that?
If I had to think off the top of my head, it would be Mike T. He seems to be one of those people that would talk about it.
I think that's who it is.
Yeah.
Because I remember hearing about this. Ryan had talked about it, a while ago, and I think it was something. I think introversion was one of them, and then I think there was another category. I'm drawing a blank now.
It might be conscientiousness, which goes along with grit, your ability to persevere and like push through adversity.
And,
right?
I think it was how. Like some people, get like really hyped up and all this kind of like the up and down. I think there was some tie between neuroticism as well, between like different methods of all that, which could also be. So I love all the personality research stuff. Everybody who's listening knows that. But I was like, who talked about that?
Yeah,
but it is.
I would have to assume it was him.
I'm 99% positive. And if it wasn't, I'm really sorry. But if somebody else listening is like,
it's safe to say he's talked about it before.
It was me.
Yeah.
No, nobody listening was probably they're like, what? They're like powerlifting and personality traits. No, nobody cares about that. But for some people, you might. And I would say that it is certainly, it's very monotonous. And it's also just very, you have to train a long time, like for a long amount of time. You got to do your prehab work. You got to do all this stuff, working up to heavy weights. Like you can't just slap that on the bar. You know what I mean? Unless you're weak as shit like me. Okay, I'm not really lifting a lot of weight, so it's not even for me. Like if I were to hit, a heavy single, I'm still not that heavy in comparison to somebody who's really, really strong. It's just it takes so much time.
It does
for the training.
The lifestyle factors play into that as well, right? Because a lot of powerlifters are getting better at it, but the more you move throughout the day, the less you actually have to warm up. Which is very valuable. But powerlifters think like I need to conserve as much energy as possible in order for me to like perform a heavy lift. And I tell my athlete, like, look, if you can't go to meet day and like do 9 lifts, and they're like, I don't know, like my bench always suffers after squat. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, how does it suffer?
How out of shape are you?
Right, exactly. So
that's a big. I mean, I don't think that's talked about enough in the performance or not the performance space, but in the powerlifting space is like just general fitness.
Right.
And I think it is shifting a little bit.
Seems to be.
But I think a lot of people really do think that like powerlifting is like, let me just lift all the weights and take 6 minutes between sets and like eat candy. And you're like, hey, like you should be like in better shape. And I think somebody who talks about this, he talks about a lot of great things, but Stan Efferding, I think, has brought a lot of awareness to just kind of, like just certain things. And I would say he's certainly brought awareness to that. Just being in general shape. Obviously he talks about a lot of things with like going for the walks and just like active recovery and doing cardio and like looking at your blood pressure. Just all these things that like, most powerlifters like, don't need that. And there's so many benefits for really everybody to be more active throughout the day. It's one of the things that I've noticed myself, and I talk so much with clients about this, just like going for walks. And there's so many reasons to time outdoor walks with, sun exposure and all this different stuff for circadian rhythm and but just getting out and moving, you feel so much better. And, we're both pretty sedentary with our work. Most people are pretty sedentary with their work. And I find, at least for myself, that when I'm sitting a lot or when I'm not doing a lot, I'm actually more fatigued.
Yeah.
And there is and
you're stiffer too, right? Yeah. Like everything just kind of aches a little bit more.
Don't really feel good. And you just, and then that compounds, right? Like, so there'll be times where it's like, I have all this stuff to do. And it's like, listen, like as much as I love training, for me at this point in my life, business comes first. Like business and productivity is my number one focus. And then, I train and eat for that now. No longer performance, no longer just physique. It's really for that. So sometimes something's got to give and it's training.
Right.
But if it's a few days and I've gone through, and this is not like hey, I really need a deload, I'm really banged up, like whatever. Sometimes that happens too. But if I go too long, it's like, it just starts to compound to like, I just don't feel good. I'm not going to feel good if I go train. And then as soon as I go train, I'm like, I feel so much better.
Right.
Like, it's crazy, but it's like, it's so easy to see how people can fall into that pattern where they just stop moving and they stop training, and then a few weeks go by and they're like, I feel so terrible, and then they start making worse decisions for all these things. It's like the more that like I get up and I'm active, and again, there is a degree, right? We're not talking about being obsessive with like taking 30,000 steps a day and like, being this person who's like running themselves into the ground. There is a point of diminishing returns, but most people who are listening are not active enough, right? And if we were to increase that by a small percentage, you would probably feel a lot better. And just like cognitively. Definitely, yeah. Oh my God. Like if I don't go for walks and stuff now, it's like I literally, as soon as I start to feel that way, I'm like, okay, I need to go do something physical. Yeah. Because I'm like low level agitated. Do you feel like you've now built that facade into your mind of like, if I feel anxiety or agitation, it is because I have to do this walk, and if I don't do this walk, then this is how I'm going to feel? Like, can you have a day without doing it, without feeling like it was a destructive day? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I feel like that's certainly that's a red flag, right? Like when you feel like you have to have it, then it's like, oh, maybe I should like pull it back a little bit, right? No, it's more so, and I certainly have obsessive tendencies and things that can pathologize like very easily in my life, but I would say that's not one of them. I would say it's more so I recognize that when I do these things, they make me feel better, or when I don't do them, I do feel a certain way. Yeah. But it's not a self-created thing. It really is a just immediate kind of benefit that I do feel. Yeah. It's the same way as just taking any period of time to just like, whether it's journal or meditate or just take a few minutes to myself in some capacity, which I never used to do. Like that completely shifts my mindset for the whole day. And I find that if I do that in the morning, that my day typically is better. And it doesn't have to be a long, like, everybody always talks about the perfect morning routine and all this different stuff. And, I get it. Like, there's not always that, you know what I mean? Like not every day is going to be this like glorious hour-long morning routine. Because if you don't have that routine, right, or if you do have that routine and it gets interrupted, then that becomes more stressful than, right? So it's like, you have to be flexible. Right. I have a basic concept of like what I want to get done in the morning, and it's like probably like something along the lines of like education or self introspection. As long as you can fall within that paradigm, whether it's like 5 or 10 minutes, or maybe you get an hour that day, then you're good, right? But like the whole idea of like 5 a.m. I wake up, 5:05 I start reading, 6:05 I'm done. Like I don't know, I can't do that. No, and I think that when people are doing that's falling into this very rigid mindset. And I try to apply flexible mindset around everything that I'm doing, but flexibility doesn't mean that don't have any structure. Yeah. Right? Like I still have structure and I still have parameters that I'm trying to operate along. But it is understanding that sometimes, hey, I might get to do all 3 things that I want to do this morning. Yep. I might get to do one of them. Yep. And sometimes it's like, hey, I can make a cup of coffee and sit down for 5 minutes. Or sometimes it's, hey, I can go for a walk and I meditated and I journal. It's going to depend on the day. Yeah. And so I think that being able to recognize though, like, okay, what is going to make my day better? Let me try to incorporate those things. And then I know we went off a whole tangent to bring this back for when we're talking about training and performance. If okay, if I'm more active during the day, if I'm doing these things, then my training session is going to be better. Why not try to do that? Is every day going to be perfect? Certainly not, because life is going to come up, kids, work, stress, like all these things are going to happen. Like things are just blowing up at work. Like life is going to happen. Today has been a day for me. There's unexpected things that are going to come up. We talk obviously a lot about sleep on here, and obviously I'm sure you talk to your athletes about this as well. We want people to have a consistent sleep schedule. I want to have a consistent sleep schedule for myself. We both know that when that gets thrown off, we probably feel dysregulated. Yeah. Do I have a perfect sleep schedule every night? Certainly not. You know what I mean? And it's like, you have to take into consideration, okay, here's all the things that make me feel better and perform better. Here's all the things that make me feel and perform worse. Okay, let's try to balance that bucket. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to try to be as optimal as possible, but we have to have optimal within a program of
bodies are pretty
life.
resilient. Like
That
they
too.
can withstand some,
Yes.
messed up,
Yes.
adverse situations and be perfectly fine.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because you brought up a great point, which is, I think is why you were asking, like, you can almost create, like, sometimes having the perfect plan can then actually make it worse for us, because if it doesn't go perfectly, right, if you're very, very perfectionistically based, which I definitely am, sometimes it's like, okay, if at 5:05 I didn't start, then my whole day is ruined. Right? I've got to start next week. And it's like, that sounds extreme, but it's really not. There's many people who fall into that
all
category.
or nothing principle, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And that's literally what, like, my whole life has revolved around, from like my grad school research to now, and like our business. Like, that's literally what we like center everything around, is having this flexible mindset and moving away from that rigidity, because it's like, that is literally I started to realize that was the root of almost everybody's problems, and mine included, and if like one thing went wrong, then okay, the whole day is trashed. And to your point, okay, say you did have a few things that were off, maybe you were feeling kind of stiff, maybe you weren't, you didn't get to go for your walks, maybe you didn't have a great night of sleep. Does that mean that you're going to have a terrible training session? Not necessarily.
Right.
But you also have to go into it recognizing, you know what, maybe my training session is not going to be the best today. If it's not, I understand, because of all these variables, but it also doesn't mean that I need to make it the worst session possible by going into it with this awful mindset. I think it's about having like a healthy dose of realism to recognize, like, you know what, some of these factors are working against me. What can I do to make it a little bit better? But also, it doesn't mean that I don't get to try.
Yeah.
So it's like this really fine line.
It is. And especially with online clients, like in person, when I was doing in-person clients and I was working with athletes, I can see by their demeanor and like how they come in and, how they greet you and how they're warming up, whether or not, I would always have like an A workout for them and I'd have a B workout. A workout was like, oh, they're primed and ready to go. We're going to get after it. And then the B workout was like, okay, they need more like restorative type stuff today, but they're still going to get some work done. They're still going to get better today, right? Like, and I think that's something that mindset can like derail you from. It's like, you can get better any day. Even if you're having a shitty day, there's still little things that you can pull away from it and improve, right? And I think that that's something as a lifter, you go into it, it's like, okay, well, today maybe my squats didn't go well, but maybe I hit a PR on split squats, or maybe I hit a PR on like one of my accessories. Like, so that tells you like, okay, well, I'm still on track. Like, I'm still getting stronger. I just had a rough start to it. And that could all be due to mindset, right? Because like you said, when you go outside and you get that sunshine, you get that fresh air, and you get that like horizon view, you start getting a little bit more dopamine released throughout the day. And dopamine's that driver that's going to get you to chase after something, right? It's that motivational driver to make you want to go and try to find something. And then if you don't do that, then you're going to have a higher prevalence of like serotonin. So when you look at some of the mechanisms of fatigue, and one of the reasons I want to study fatigue is like, it's a bit of unknown charted territory. So they don't really have like the exact science behind why people get fatigued. But one of the ways they were looking at it was looking at serotonin and dopamine. And as serotonin increases, dopamine tends to decrease. And that typically is going to decrease their ability to go to these time to exhaustion trials that they look at all the research on. And that's usually how they look at fatigue in a lot of ways, right? So they'll look at your 5-HT, which is serotonin that gets produced, and that can get produced through tryptophan, which is a amino acid, right? So if you have high levels of tryptophan in your system, that's not as important as like the free tryptophan that binds to albumin, right? That can cause higher issues because that can go through the blood-brain barrier, and then that can create more serotonin. So if you have that type of stuff, that's going to cause you to be more sleepy, more in the here and now, and more kind of relaxed. So that's not going to really allow you to push and train, right? So the more dopamine you can get, right, and that you can produce naturally, not that you're trying to chase after it, the better you're going to be when that training session comes. So if you do those things to set yourself up, you're going to be at a higher state of ready to perform when it comes to training. And that's one of the things that drives like your ability to perform on that day is like, oh, my warm-ups felt good, so therefore my set's going to feel good. Very few times you go in like, oh, my warm-ups feel heavy, I'm going to have a good session, right? And that's where the mental aspect of things come in. And how do you set yourself up to have that like mental acuity to be positive and to push through? And a lot of it does come with the lifestyle factors that go into that.
Oh, lifestyle sets everything up.
Yeah.
A lot of people look at training in isolation and then they're surprised, when things don't go so great for their training session,
right,
or their recovery, or their, strength improvements, or their muscle building, whatever it is. It's like your training session for most people is probably going to be about an hour, right? For maybe a powerlifter, it might be 3 hours, but it's going to be 4 hours depending on what you're doing. But let's just say it's an hour, right? an hour or two of your day, like we have to look at everything else. Like these lifestyle factors are going to really, really matter. And again, it's not just on a day-to-day basis. It's on a week-to-week and month-to-month. You know, if you're trashing your body for like months on end and you're like, I don't know, I'm not getting stronger. I don't know, my gym sessions are really shitty and I'm just slamming caffeine and I'm not sleeping and I'm not getting outside. I'm not really moving and I'm going all these time zones. And my mindset is now in the gutter around my training performance. Well, how are we going to expect to get better?
Right.
You know what I mean? And again, it's also not saying that every day has to be perfect in order for you to have a good training session, because that is not realistic either. And if you're only going into it when you think, oh, all the stars have aligned, I'm going to like hit a squat PR.
You'll never be at the gym.
Yeah, you're never going to be at the gym. And I mean, how many times, I know it's like literally so cliche, but so like some of the worst days where you're like, I just do not want to train today. You have like the best sessions.
Of course.
You know what I mean? Like it's just, and it's so interesting. When you were talking about the serotonin and dopamine, which obviously I love, have they looked at like SSRIs and stuff with all that? Like have they, I'm just curious and interested.
They haven't necessarily
like training performance and SSRIs. Probably not, that's so niche, but this
is very much endurance based as well. Okay. So it doesn't necessarily correlate to strength training. Those could be different fatigue mechanisms. But with what they found was when they gave someone a serotonin agonist, right, fatigue hit faster. When they gave them a serotonin antagonist, they were able to delay fatigue, right? Which is kind of the same idea of like SSRIs and things along that nature. When they gave someone an amphetamine, they were able to train much longer, right? And you think about...
Surprise.
Right. So stuff like Adderall, stuff like, you know, I've heard people, and I've talked to several people where they did LSD, which is something that really boosts up your dopamine. And they were able to improve, I think it was like a 10-mile run by like 30 minutes, just because they had that like feel good drive and dopamine. And if dopamine's high, serotonin's going to be low. And there are ways nutritionally to blunt serotonin. What they looked at was, because tryptophan is one of those biggest drivers of serotonin, they were like, okay, well, maybe if we introduced more amino acids, then maybe there wouldn't be as much tryptophan to be released to go through the blood-brain barrier, and then maybe serotonin. What they found was in the field studies, they was able to see an improvement, but obviously with field studies, you can't restrict all the variables, so it's hard to like tell what was what. And then when they went into the lab, branched chain amino acids didn't really do much for fatigue. And their theory behind that is the more amino acids you have, the more ammonia your body produces. And ammonia is a toxin that your body produces, and that can really blunt your ability to push through fatigue as well. So they were like, okay, well, it may not be amino acids. So what would be the next thing to stop tryptophan from coming in? And since tryptophan binds to albumin, if we can get the free fatty acids to, because what happens, right, like as you're training, you have free fatty acid release, and that has a higher propensity to bind to albumin than the tryptophan. So if the tryptophan is not binding to the albumin, then it's more free floating, and then that's when it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and that's when serotonin rises. So if you take away that, right, the free fatty acids, then you'll have more tryptophan binding to the albumin, so you'll have less going into the blood-brain barrier. So what they found was carbohydrates can do that, because if carbohydrates will blunt your ability to use free fatty acids, because your insulin spiking. If your insulin spiking, you're going to be using carbs as your primary source. So a lot of the research shows that carbohydrates are going to be better to blunt your serotonin release and give you higher thresholds of fatigue performance. So you're able to push beyond placebo effect and push beyond. They did one with carbohydrates and amino acids, and there was no difference between the two, but it was a big difference between that and the placebo group. And that's kind of one of the things that they think is going on there. And then also too, if you look at the research, if you start a session with lower glycogen levels, that's going to create this idea of a higher rate of perceived exertion. So it's not so much that like the low glycogen levels is going to stop you from being able to perform. It's just the fact that it feels harder when you start. And that's going to be one of the limiting drivers. And that's where the brain comes into play. So if you can top off your glycogen stores, then it feels a little bit easier. Then you'll be able to push through that exhaustion state. So there is some dynamics of like physiology that you can use to improve fatigue, along with like the brain mechanism stuff as well. And that's strictly for like endurance stuff. When you're thinking about strength training and fatigue mechanisms, one of the things that I like to look at is like, you know, they've done some research, and it's very like correlational in my mind now, looking at it is like how you leave a session can determine how you go into the next session. So one of the things that I've gotten away from was like this big driver of like volume, like, oh, okay, it's the end of the workout. Let's do some metabolite buildup so we can, get as much hypertrophy as possible. And then knowing that the higher the volume, the closer you go to failure, the more central nervous system fatigue you're going to accumulate. So I was like, okay, well, let's get away from that. And now let's just focus on, let's end the session with like some prehab stuff, some rehab stuff to get you ready for the next session, right? So if you have low bar squats on a Tuesday and you're finishing up your bench workout on Monday, maybe we'll do some band retractions. Maybe we'll do some things that like free up your pec and get more shoulder mobility so that when you do get under the bar, right, there's not a lot of stress and strain, but it's not very taxing. So they're going to leave that workout like, oh man, my shoulders feel great. My chest feels great. My body feels great. It wasn't the hardest workout in the world. And now I'm ready to go for squats the next day. And then also being able to do some type of parasympathetic arousal, state at the end of a workout where, you get down on the ground, feet up, box breathing, doing that for 5 minutes, even doing something like the bike, really, really low intensity for 5 minutes, and just have them visualize or have them do box breathing. Those things are going to have them leaving that session feeling really good and really confident for the next day. And I think that's more important, getting them ready for that next day. That's going to drive them to be more successful. Because if you're doing that metabolite buildup, if you're doing all that failure training, then you may get higher rates of muscle soreness. If your muscles are sore, they're not going to be able to fire as well. And then you're also going to be a little bit stiff when you get under that bar. You get under that bar stiff, then your elbow starts to hurt, and then your bench press sucks, right? Because your elbow hurts. So this is like perpetual cycle. And that's one of the things why when people think about like variations within strength sports and they'll do a 12-week block. I hear this all the time. Like, oh, my athlete, their shoulders and elbows always get messed up when we do low bar squats. So we're not going to low bar squat all off season. And then it's like, well, then you're just hiding the problem. You're not actually fixing it. Because when they go back to low bar squat, guess what? Their shoulder and elbows are still going to be fucked, right? So why not we just keep those in there, right? And we sporadically throw them in there for singles along the way. And then we can see if the movements that we're doing are actually improving that ability to get under the bar. Oh, now they're low bar, their elbows don't hurt. So maybe now we can low bar all year round. And if you're going to argue with me that low bar squatting year round is going to produce worse results than a safety squat bar for 8 weeks, a cambered bar for 8 weeks, a high bar for 8 weeks, and then a low bar for 8 weeks, if you have that same time frame of just like specific low bar work, I'm pretty sure the athlete that's doing the low bar work is going to be a lot stronger doing low bar squats in a competition than someone that has tons of variation throughout. And then people also use like, variation limits their risk of injury. And to me, that just, the rationality behind that makes no sense. There's no research to propagate that either, right? So you mean to tell me if I have a bar on my back, right, and I'm squatting, my knees, hips, they all break and bend and do what they're supposed to do. Now I have a bar here. Now all of a sudden my hips and knees are going to do something so completely different that there's no wear and tear on them. Like, I just don't buy that concept. It just doesn't really make sense to me. And I don't think that they're ever going to find research to like articulate that, because you're not going to be able to do someone with like a 24-week research on low bar squatting.
So much of this stuff when we're talking about really, really specific groups, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's powerlifters or bodybuilders, you're never going to be able to get research for that. And then the people who are academically minded, who happen to be in those sports, they want that, right? Which I understand.
Yeah,
but I'm like,
it's not realistic.
It's not realistic. Like,
right.
If you're asking that, it's because you probably haven't done research. And I don't say that in a disparaging way. I just mean that there are a lot of limitations with what we can do.
Right.
And also, the most important thing when it comes to research is not only what we can do, it's the subjects that we have. So you're going to tell me as a high-level strength athlete or as a high-level bodybuilder that you're going to let some nerdy scientist control your training block for this big meet you're prepping for or this big bodybuilding show? Hell no. Like, you're not. You know what I mean? Like, you're not going to let somebody. That's why we have case studies in bodybuilding. I mean, powerlifting is even more niche, and like less people even care about that.
Then they shit on the case studies, right? It's like, if it doesn't fit my bias, then I can easily poo-poo it and like, oh, case studies, that's not relevant, because it's, where's the mass
It's like,
audience?
Well, then do you want to sign up for this? Because I certainly don't. As much as I love research, if I'm prepping for a bodybuilding show, I am not letting somebody else control that. You know what I mean? I'm just not. I'm not going to put myself in a group of 30 other individuals and be put on the same diet.
Right.
And you can't tailor it because then that's not research.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? So it's like, that's why we don't get these kinds of things. And we have to either do observational studies, or we have to look at different pieces of literature and say, okay, let's take these 5 studies. Let's come together with this maybe conclusion.
Right.
And then let's try it with our athletes, because that's what coaching is, right?
Well, yeah,
and that's what's most important. I don't think that it's even necessary to say, hey, in this specific population, this is exactly what we looked at, you know? And I mean, we've gotten pretty close, at least with Dr. Campbell's lab, you know, like very specific, like, hey, we're doing physique research, right? Yep. Like, we're very interested in that, specifically female physique research. But that's just that's just like so niche compared to most labs, you know what I mean? I'm so very grateful that he's been able to do that. But even outside of that, these are not high level athletes, and the type of research that we're doing with that is going to be observational things or case studies. And to me, I'm like, that's great. We're just gathering more data, and more data is just going to show us more trends. And that's where, you know, an evidence-based model, right, is important. And it's like, just because a paper came out and showed one thing, and then another paper came out and showed something completely opposite, I'm not going to say, oh, we're going to throw these methods away.
It happens though.
Well, of course, because that's the person who is just looking at the research and not looking at their client,
right?
You know, or clients just in general as a body of individuals, you know, and that's when you really have to take, okay, like, what does the current literature say? Where is it pointing us in this direction? Let's try this within reason. But ultimately, if we're talking about a client-centric model, we need to be doing what's working for the client.
Exactly.
And that's where it's going to be, you know, what kind of feedback are they getting? You know, what feedback are they giving us? How are they feeling? How are they performing? Everybody, you know, when we're talking about, you know, especially with fatigue, everybody really does have a different capacity. And I'm sure that you've noticed this with the people that you've trained over the years. Like, there are people who just have a very high tolerance for volume and workload, and just as a general sense, right?
Yep.
And then there's some people who just have a much lower capacity, and that could be because of a lot of different reasons, right? And that could also change. That same individual could change over time depending on what is going on in their life. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Maybe
they were somebody who tolerated a lot at one point in their life, but now they're a new parent and they got a new job and they have all these other things. It's like that work capacity is probably going to be different. So, you know, is that going to be explained in a paper?
Right.
You know, probably not.
Yeah.
But those are the things that you have to pick up on as a coach to recognize, okay, like, this is like what is happening on the individual level to this person. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with research. We should be doing more research to learn more things.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't mean that we should only do things because there, you know, something in PubMed says that we should.
Because research has its flaws in and of itself, right?
Goodness. Like, so many flaws.
They present us with these models, and then people buy into these models, and then we follow them no matter what, right? Like the gas principle to define somebody's ability to train and recover. Everyone uses the gas principle, but like you said, the gas principle doesn't take in the life stressors, the biopsychosocial model, right? So then you look at allostatic load and you're like, okay, maybe that's a better predictor of stress. But, you know, no one wants to buy into that because the gas model is what we've been fed since the 1920s. Same thing with like fatigue. Everyone wants to do muscle fatigue as the biggest driver of why people quit and in their time trials. And that's because, you know, A.V. Hill back in 1926 did his thing, and like that's what he proposed. Is like it's muscular failure, has nothing to do with the brain, right? And there's a lot of pushback by certain individuals, but the predominant like idea is like, this is the model we've been fed, this is the model we're going to do, so we're going to build our ideology to fit this model, because there's no way we can go against this model. We can't be contrarian within science, because then we'll be outcast and then we won't be part of the cool kids, right? And you'll see that with like hypertrophy training, and you know, you have these people, this is the hypertrophy guru, here's the pedestal, so whatever he puts out, we're not even going to question it. It's, you know, the gospel. But it's like, well, no, right? Because then you look at it and you're like, oh, there's tons of flaws here. Like, oh, they did a back workout and they found more bicep growth in their back workout than most researchers find. And when they do actual bicep work, I was like, okay, well, there's an issue there. And then, oh, this growth is like 3 times. It's astronomical growth. And they're doing back workouts. Like, maybe we should like question this, but we can't, because this person's on the top of the hierarchy. So it's like, and then, you know, when you look at evidence-based, it's like evidence-based is the research plus anecdote plus the client, right? Everyone just gets rid of the client and the anecdote. So there's definitely a lot of flaws. And as a researcher, especially being around Dr. Buckner, it's like having that contrarian mindset of like, maybe we should question these things. And then if we have like something that's really solid and our own biases, maybe we should question those. Maybe we should build our research to question our own biases instead of just trying to perpetuate this continuous cycle of like bad narratives just so we can make a little bit of extra money when we publish our ebook.
And it's so frustrating because a lot of people look to science to be unbiased, right? Or they think if you're a scientist that you're unbiased, and it's actually it's actually not true at all. You know what I mean? And it's easier to, like you said, the word ideology was perfect because it's like, all right, well, this person studies this. Okay, that kind of get along with that. Here, I'll just go along with this idea. And I'm going to put now 5 papers out that look at this same thing. And we're not going to ever question it. And we're going to keep going along with it. And that's how you get funding. And then that's how you, like you said, you become friends with this person. And this gets elevated. And for people to think that it's this, you know, I absolutely love science, but it's not without its flaws. And especially when we're talking about like the university model with the, like just the way that funding works and all these different things.
The way you get tenured, you pretty much have to stick to what you're doing.
Exactly. Like there are so many there's so many reasons why this happens. You know, it's not that these people are necessarily bad people. I mean, some of them might be, but you know, it's not that they're outlandishly horrible people. It's just the way that the system is set up. And if you're not aware of your own biases and aware of falling into that, it can be, you know, you just end up promoting that same thing and never really changing your viewpoint. And so that's why it is important to say, okay, like, let's look at this. Okay, this is interesting. And let's see how this applies when we're talking about, you know, coaching, you know, working with clients on an individual basis or even a group basis. Like, okay, when we're talking about either public health initiatives, you know, whatever it is, like education like this or clients, whatever. Okay, we need to take a full perspective. And it's so interesting when you talked about the allostatic load. So I have a client I've been working with now for years, and she's somebody who, you know, when people, one thing that I always want to bash my head against the wall, people are just, it's just CCO. And it's like, CCO is important, but there's other things outside of that. You know what I mean? And once you've worked with enough people, you'll realize that there are other things, other factors outside of just calories in versus calories out that are affecting their body composition. And I have a client, and she shared this on her story the other day, and she's somebody who is in a very, very tough school program right now. She has been for the past 2 years. And we've been on top of her diet, on top of her training, all these different things and managing. There's been, you know, some other life stuff come up as well, but there's been a lot of different stressors. We'll just say that. There hasn't been a lot of other changes outside of those things. And you know, she's finally getting back to a place where her body is in a more responsive spot. But for a while, it was completely unresponsive with really no other changes. Yeah. And so for somebody to say, oh, this girl must be falling off of her plan, or she's eating too many calories or doing that. No, she's not. Right. You know what I mean? Like, this person is not doing that. Now, does everybody have an off day or two? Of course. But in a general scheme of things, you can't explain these few months. Right. Just CCO was off, you know? So it's like, there are so many different things. And now, is that going to be every client? No. Right. But we can't take that like out of the picture. Right. You know, and I was even I interviewed Dr. Dom D'Agostino on the podcast last week. And he was talking about how, you know, and these are things that I've seen with clients, but now we're finally getting more research for, okay, when there is, you know, this brain inflammation, there's going to also, like when there's more gut permeability and all of that, it's going to go also to the blood-brain barrier. And then, so they're seeing now in the literature, gut health and mental health intercorrelated essentially. Yeah. And it's like, these are all things that I've known and I've seen, you know what I mean? But like, now we're finally getting the research. So like, I'm never going to say to a client, like, this isn't real because there's not a paper on this yet. Right. You know what I mean? Or there isn't an exact perfect paper to define this. It's like, after you see a few clients with the same kind of trends, you start to go, okay, there's something here. Yeah. You know, and my clients who have the highest levels of stress or the worst stress perception, actually, in particular, who are also having these gut issues, or people who have a lot of, you know, background trauma that they're working through, are having these gut issues. This isn't just random. Right. You know, like, there's something here. It's really, really interesting. So it's great to use science to clarify these points and to show new areas, new directions. Make you ask better questions. Exactly. It's really what it should just do. It should say, hey, here's this information. Okay, what's the next question? Yeah. What's this? And that should prompt more questions from people. And that's really what this should be all about. So I know that you haven't started the program quite yet, but because you just graduated. So do you know yet what you're like particularly interested in? Do you have like a study idea yet? Or are you just kind of like going into it open-minded? Well, the professor that I'm going to be working with, Dr. DMAC, she did her dissertation on critical threshold model.
with deadlifts. And so that's kind of where she does a lot of her research on, and resistance training and fatigue. And I know her current PhD student that she's working with, she's doing looking at some things with like sex differences, which would be really cool. And then there's also Professor Dawes out there who works with the tactical side, and due to my background in military and stuff, she thought it'd be really cool to work with him on some of the fatigue mechanisms of the tactical side of things. So as of right now, I'm more interested in the aerobic side of fatigue, due to the big part that the brain plays with that. So that would be a lot of fun for me. How you build that study out is going to be tough, right? Yeah. Because they do have stuff within the apartment that Dr. DeFreitas has that can look at like the brain chemistry and all those things. So it opens the possibilities of having some really cool research, but just being able to like pinpoint what is reality versus like what I think would be a cool research model is something totally different. And I don't quite understand that yet because I haven't been in their lab. So I have some ideas of like, you know, if we can get someone to do time to exhaustion trials, but then also look at some of the neurotransmitters inside and look at like maybe if the hippocampus is going off or if this is going off, and then we can start to pinpoint, you know, maybe some of the biochemistry inside of that. That would be really cool. So rad. Whether or not that I can do that, I don't know. I think so.
I'm cheering for you. I want you to be able to do that. Because when you were talking about that, I was like, that would be so cool to combine those two things and to be able to get those values just to see purely out of interest, you know, because neurotransmitters, especially when we're talking about dopamine and serotonin, they are so important for so many aspects of life, but especially with performance and fatigue. So, and
acetylcholine is another one to add in there as far as like performance goes.
Yeah, that would be awesome. So I'm going to vote for that. I think you should do that. Well, thank you so much. This was really interesting and insightful. And I know we talked about a bunch of different things, which is pretty standard for our show.
Oh, good. I didn't want to ruin the mechanisms of the show by going off on derailed tangents.
It's me. I'm literally always down 87 different rabbit holes of everything. So thank you so much, Tony, for coming on. Where can people find you, find more about you, coaching services, all that good stuff? I know you don't like talking about yourself, but at least hype it up for like a few sentences, you know?
So we have an educational website called coachescorneru.com where we do monthly webinars, and we also have, I would say, close to over 100 videos of 45 minutes to hour-long lectures on going over all these principles and models for nutrition, building your business, training, physiology side of things. And then we also do a certification that is a 12-week course that's worth 2 CEUs, and that can all be found on coachescorneru.com. or go to Coaches Corner U on Instagram. And then if you are interested in coaching, you can just go to Tony Montgomery Jr. on Instagram. I've really curtailed all that. I cut my website off and everything because I just want to be focused on my PhD. I found that the idea of these people investing in me, I want to make sure that I invest in them, and I can't do that by getting pulled in 20 million different directions. I just wouldn't feel right about doing that. So coaching is very limited, but if you are interested, shoot me a message and we can go from there.
Yeah, and I will be sure to link all of that in the show notes, everybody. If they can find that, especially, coaches, that'll be perfect. So I will link all of that for you guys. And I think that's such a great thing that you recognize that capacity for yourself, because there are so many people who don't.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about individualized coaching, and not just a program, because I think that there's different layers and levels to what people need.
Of course.
Right?
Yep.
A program is really great to get somebody on their, to get started, right? And there's nothing, that's one thing I've changed my mind over time. You come from this elitist background of one-on-one coaching is it? Some people just need a program.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's just what they need to start, or maybe that's what they need forever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But when we're talking about one-on-one coaching, there's a big difference of, being able to give enough attention and quality of detail to somebody. And even if just the mental capacity that it takes to work with a large amount of people, it's really hard, that takes a lot of effort. So it's definitely one of those things that I think hats off to you, because there's entirely too many people who just become a coaching mill. And then it's you don't hear from a coach. We still hear that
live with myself. I did that.
I literally still hear that to this day. I don't hear from somebody for 2 weeks at a time and this and that. And it's not oh, sorry, something came up, radio silence.
That's
I
crazy.
Could not imagine. But anyways, one more tangent before I wrap it up. You guys know how I am. So thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please share it. This is the best way that you can support us. For more information on one-on-one coaching, visit teamlocofit.com and be sure to join our email list for great information and to be the first to hear about the app we will be releasing in a few months.